You're not going to believe what this wild lion did. Not in Africa, but right here in the hills of Montana. A tiny cub on the brink of death. A father who never gave up, and a dog. Yes, a dog who became the bridge between fear and trust. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey of instinct, loss, and silent love, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us till the end. You won't want to miss the moment that left even seasoned rangers speechless. The morning light draped the small town of Ashridge, Montana, in a quiet, golden hush. Fog still clung to the earth like breath held too long, and dew shimmered along the grass at the forest's edge. It was early autumn, and the chill in the air carried the faint scent of pine, earth, and distant rain. Aiden Clark, a freckled 13-year-old with tousled red hair and the lingering awkwardness of youth, tugged his sleeves down as he strolled along the narrow dirt path with Scout, his companion for the past 8 months. Scout was a German shepherd, 9 years old, with graying fur at the muzzle and a long scar running down his left hind leg, an old injury from his time as a rescue dog in Arizona. He was large, with sharp, intelligent eyes the color of dark amber and the calm poise of someone who had seen too much to panic easily. His gait was slower these days, thoughtful even, but his nose was as sharp as ever. Aiden adored him. They had been paired through a local canine adoption program for veterans and kids with anxiety. And though Aiden wasn't a veteran, his quiet demeanor and tendency to avoid crowds made Scout the perfect fit. That morning, they had wandered closer to the forest than usual. Ashridge lay nestled between mountain ridges and thick woods, and the trees bordering the town had always been a place of myth, both beautiful and ominous. The path wound through birches and cottonwoods, their leaves already tinged with orange and gold, the forest whispering secrets only Scout seemed to understand. Suddenly, Scout stopped, his ears perked up, nose lifted, body going rigid. Aiden paused too, instinctively tightening his grip on the leash. "Scout," he whispered. The dog didn't respond. He took a few steps forward, sniffing the ground, then jerked his head to the left, into the woods. There, half hidden beneath the underbrush, was a thin trail of something dark and fresh. Blood. Not much, but enough for a trained nose like Scout's to catch. And then came the paw prints, massive, uneven, heavy. Not bear, not mountain lion, something bigger, something unexpected. Before Aiden could react, Scout was already moving, nose low, body slinking between the trunks like he was back on a mission. The leash slipped from Aiden's fingers. He tried to call out, then stopped. Something in the way Scout moved told him this wasn't something to interrupt. The forest swallowed them whole. Aiden ran after him, stumbling over roots and ducking under branches. The deeper they went, the more the air changed. It grew still, too still. No bird song, no rustling squirrels, just the distant drip of dew and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. Then, in a small clearing bathed in filtered light, Scout stopped. There, just beyond a moss-covered log, was a sight neither boy nor dog could have prepared for. A lion, a full-grown African lion, not a zoo escapee, not a hallucination. A real lion, his golden fur dulled with dust and his mane tangled with leaves and burrs. He was massive, with shoulders like boulders and deep scars lining his flanks. But his eyes, those amber eyes, were locked not in aggression, but in something far more human. Desperation. He lay there with his front paws wrapped protectively around a smaller figure. A lion cub, barely a few weeks old, its body limp, breathing shallow. Blood soaked one of its tiny legs, and a gash ran across its shoulder. It wasn't moving, save for the faintest twitch of breath. The adult lion didn't roar. He didn't pounce. Instead, he let out a low, guttural rumble. Not a warning, but a plea. A sound that traveled straight to the marrow, bypassing all logic. It wasn't an animal's growl. It was a father's grief. Scout froze. His ears flicked back. For a moment, the old dog stared straight into the lion's eyes. No bark, no snarl. Just stillness, followed by a slow, respectful step forward. Then another. Aiden, heart thudding so loudly he could barely breathe, crouched behind the log and watched a Scout approach the lion and its cub. The two animals, canine and feline, stood barely feet apart, both scarred by separate worlds, both guided by instinct and something greater, trust. The lion didn't move as Scout sniffed the cub gently. He let him come close. There was no tension, only a thin thread of understanding stretching between the three beings in the clearing. Scout turned his head and looked back at Aiden. A single sharp bark escaped him. Not panicked, not frantic, just clear. Come! Aiden stepped out from behind the log, trembling but drawn by something he didn't fully understand. His legs moved before his fear could catch up. He had seen hurt animals before. His dad was a veterinarian before leaving the family, and his mother still volunteered at the shelter. But nothing like this. Nothing so sacred. The lion looked at him now, and Aiden, wide-eyed and breathless, didn't feel fear. He felt invited. He dropped to his knees a few feet from the cub. "We need help," he whispered. "We need Dr. Grace." He fumbled for his phone and dialed. The wind picked up over Ashridge Ridge as the morning sun grew stronger, casting slanted rays through the thinning mist. The trees stirred gently, whispering through their coppery leaves. In the clearing, everything felt suspended in time. The lion, the cub, the boy, and the dog. 4 creatures from different worlds, yet somehow sharing the same fragile breath of fate. Scout, standing alert beside the injured cub, turned back toward Aiden with a firm look in his amber eyes. The message was clear. This wasn't over. They needed help, fast. Aiden's hands shook as he held the phone to his ear. His heart was still racing, both from adrenaline and the surreal weight of what he was witnessing. The call connected. A warm, tired voice answered. "Grace Holloway, who is this?" "Dr. Grace? It's Aiden Clark. I'm out near Ashridge Trail, and my dog found a lion. A real lion. And he's got a cub. The cub's hurt. Really bad." There was a silence on the other end, and then a sigh. "That's not funny, Aiden. I'm not joking. Please. I think the cub's dying." Grace Holloway was not the kind of woman who wasted time. In her mid-50s, she had a tall, wiry frame from decades of field work and mountain hiking. Her face was lined, not unkindly, but like paper that had been folded too many times. Her dark hair was always pulled back into a no-nonsense bun, and her eyes steel gray mist little. Ever since her husband, Martin, had died 3 years ago in a snowstorm while trying to rescue an elk calf tangled in a fence, Grace had withdrawn from much of the world. She kept to her ranch at the edge of town, working only with domesticated animals and refusing calls that involved anything wild. Too risky, too raw. But something in Aiden's voice, some mix of terror and awe, cut through the walls she had built. "Don't move," she said quietly. "I'll be there in 20. She didn't ask for more details. She just grabbed her bag packed, always out of habit, and walked out to her old tan Jeep Cherokee. Scout, meanwhile, had returned to Aiden's side and sat calmly at the boy's feet. The lion had not moved. He simply watched. 20 minutes later, the crunch of tires on dry leaves signaled Grace's arrival. She stepped out of the Jeep wearing her worn field coat, khaki pants tucked into scuffed hiking boots, and a brown canvas satchel slung over one shoulder. Her gait was steady, brisk, but not rushed. Grace Holloway approached life like she approached wounded animals, firmly but without fear. Aiden emerged from the underbrush. "He's still there." He led her back through the winding trail, Scout trotting silently beside them. When they reached the clearing, Grace stopped cold. There, under the partial shade of an alder tree, lay the lion. His golden fur glowed in the morning light, his mane tangled and wild, but it was the eyes, those deep, tired, burning eyes that held her still. She had seen eyes like that once before, years ago, in a mirror after Martin's funeral. The cub was barely breathing. Grace dropped to one knee slowly, not taking her gaze off the lion. "He hasn't moved?" she asked. "Only to shield the cub," Aiden replied. "He never growled at us." Scout stayed close, watching both humans and the lion carefully. With deliberate slowness, Grace opened her satchel and removed a pair of surgical gloves and a small flashlight. She approached the cub in a wide arc, keeping her body low, her movement smooth and quiet. The lion's ears flicked, but he did not rise. When she knelt just a foot from the cub, the lion let out a deep, vibrating hum, low, like thunder rumbling underground. "I hear you," she whispered. "I'm not taking him from you. I'm just trying to help." The cub's leg was broken. Compound fracture. Bite wound on the shoulder, likely from another lion, probably a rival male. It was a miracle the little one was even alive. "We can't do this here," she muttered. "He needs real care." "You're taking him?" Aiden asked, barely above a whisper. Grace looked over at him, then at Scout, then back at the lion. Only if your friend lets me. She pulled a soft fleece blanket from her satchel and spread it beside the cub. Her fingers were steady as she gently lifted the broken limb, slipping a splint underneath and wrapping it tight with gauze. All the while, the lion watched tense, but still. When Grace finally wrapped the cub in the blanket, the lion stood. A soft growl escaped him, not threatening, but anxious. He paced once, then stepped back. It wasn't permission. It was surrender. She lifted the cub slowly into her arms, cradling it as one would a human child. The weight was light, too light. "We need to go," she said. Scout led the way back through the trees, ears alert. The lion followed behind them, at a distance, silent as shadow. At the jeep, Grace gently placed the cub in a large crate cushioned with towels and heated packs. The lion watched from 20 feet away, still and watchful. "What if he follows us?" Aiden asked. Grace looked at him. "Let him." As they drove back toward town, the sun crested fully above the mountains, warming the valley with pale gold. In the rearview mirror, Grace saw the lion watching them disappear into the trees. The sun dipped behind the hills of Ashridge, casting long ochre shadows across the dry grass and pine-shaded ridges. A faint chill drifted in with the dusk as Grace Holloway pulled into the gravel drive of her cabin on the outskirts of town. Her home was a modest log structure-weathered cedar siding, a small porch with 2 creaking wooden chairs, and a green tin roof that rattled in the wind. Behind it stretched the edge of the forest where man and wilderness met in uneasy truce. Scout jumped from the jeep before it came to a full stop, his tail low but wagging gently as he inspected the perimeter of the cabin, always on alert even in retirement. The lion cub, still wrapped in fleece and nestled in a makeshift crate, let out a barely audible groan as Grace lifted him carefully into her arms. His tiny ribs fluttered with shallow breath, and his golden fur was matted with old blood. "I know, little one," she murmured. "You've got to fight just a little longer." Inside, the cabin was dim and quiet, the walls lined with books and old wildlife photographs. A single oil lamp flickered on the kitchen table, casting soft light over the aged wood. Grace cleared a space near the fireplace and laid down a large dog bed lined with thermal blankets. She gently placed the cub there, arranging towels to keep his body stable. Scout padded over and sat beside the bed, ears perked, watching the small body twitch with each uneven breath. Though Grace had treated hundreds of animals in her career, from eagles with broken wings to deer tangled in the barbed wire, something about this cub felt different. Maybe it was the way he had been delivered, not dropped off or rescued, but offered by a creature who, by every natural law, should have attacked. She checked the dressing on the cub's leg. The splint had held, but the wound on the shoulder had begun to seep again. She retrieved a small syringe from her bag and filled it with a diluted dose of amoxicillin, her hands working from memory. When she injected it into the cub's flank, he let out a faint cry, more a breath than a sound. Grace sat back on her heels, running a hand down her face. "Dusty," she said quietly, "that's what I'll call you. You're light and you're holding on." Scout gave a soft whine as if agreeing. He lay down beside the bed, his head resting just inches from Dusty's outstretched paw. Night came swiftly. The wind moaned through the trees, tapping pine needles against the window panes. Grace made tea but didn't drink it. She moved in slow circles, adjusting the heat pad, rechecking vitals, logging notes. Every 20 minutes she dabbed Dusty's dry lips with warm glucose water, though most of it dripped back out. He was fading, and she knew it. Outside, beyond the narrow kitchen window, the dark was thick and heavy, but just at the tree line, something glowed faintly. 2 amber orbs, unblinking. Leo. He hadn't followed the jeep the whole way, but he'd found them. He sat now beneath the trees, still as carved stone, staring toward the house. Grace had seen mountain lions stalk prey, and she'd seen wolves approach in defense of their young. But this was something else entirely. He made no attempt to move closer. He simply watched. She stepped out onto the porch with a flashlight, but didn't shine it in his direction. Instead, she stood in the quiet and spoke softly into the dark. "He's still alive. I don't know for how long." Scout came to stand beside her, his ears flicking at every sound. Together, they watched the lion watch them. A sudden rustle came from the gravel driveway. Grace turned sharply. A new figure stepped out of the shadows, tall, wiry, and carrying a small thermos and backpack. It was Thomas Green, the town's forest warden. In his early 60s, with a deeply tanned face and snow-white hair under a faded ranger cap, Thomas had been Grace's friend and Martin's once. His eyes were sharp but never intrusive, and his voice always carried the quiet patience of someone who'd spent years listening to trees before speaking. "Heard you had a visitor," he said, nodding toward the woods. "More than one," Grace replied, gesturing toward the cabin. Thomas stepped in, removed his boots by the door, and crouched beside the cub. "God above," he muttered. "He's a fighter." "He's on the edge," Grace said. "We've got about 12 hours to keep him breathing." "I brought some emergency blood plasma from the rescue trailer," Thomas said, setting his bag on the floor. "For canines and felines under 50 pounds. Don't know if it'll work, but it's worth a try." Grace's hands were already moving before he finished speaking. They worked together in silence, carefully inserting the IV and taping it to the cub's leg. Dusty shivered once, then stilled again. Thomas stayed until midnight. They talked little, only exchanged looks when Dusty's breath stuttered or his heartbeat flickered under the stethoscope. When Thomas left, he paused at the porch. "You know," he said, "if this cub pulls through, we'll have to figure out what to do with the father." Grace glanced toward the trees. Leo hadn't moved. "He's not going anywhere." She watched Thomas drive off, then return to the fire. Scout had fallen asleep beside Dusty, ears twitching with dreams. Grace sat in the armchair across from them and finally allowed herself to close her eyes. But every few minutes she jolted awake to check the cub, to listen for breathing. Just before dawn, a sound broke the hush. It was a whimper. Dusty's head shifted slightly on the blanket. His tiny tongue licked at the corner of his mouth. His paw twitched. And his breath, while shallow, was no longer gasping. It was steady. Scout lifted his head and let out a short bark, almost cheerful. Grace leaned forward and smiled, for the first time in days. "Welcome back, Dusty." Outside, as the light broke through the trees, Leo rose to his feet. A shadow moved across his face. Then, without a sound, he lay down again, still watching. Morning unfolded slowly across Ashridge. The sky was painted in soft blues and pale oranges, and a light mist lingered like a veil over the dew-covered grass. In the clearing beyond the cabin, the tall trees stood still, and Leo, the lion, remained nestled within the shadows, silent, unmoving, but unmistakably present. Inside the cabin, Grace Holloway sat at her worn kitchen table, her hand wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee. Dusty, the lion cub, lay bundled in his fleece blanket on the dog bed near the hearth. His breathing was steadier now, though faint. Scout rested beside him, one paw extended protectively toward the small cub, his ears twitching as if he were listening to something that existed just beyond human perception. Grace's eyes were fixed not on Dusty, but on the small framed photograph hanging near the back door. It showed a younger version of herself, freckled, sun-tanned, laughing arm in arm, with a tall man in ranger green. Martin Holloway, her husband, her compass. Her reason once for venturing into the wild without hesitation. She rose slowly, took the frame down, and brought it to the table. The surface was dusty. She wiped it with her sleeve. Martin had been a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered, always smelling of cedar and campfire smoke. His voice had been deep but gentle, his hands always warm. He wasn't fearless, but he was calm, steady, like the earth itself. He died 3 winters ago, in the worst blizzard Ashridge had seen in a decade. That morning had started like so many others, a call from a farmer who'd spotted a trapped moose calf near the river. Martin had strapped on his boots and kissed her forehead, promising he'd be back by lunch. Grace had offered to go with him, but he smiled and said, "You've got a surgery this morning. I'll be fine." He never came back. They found his body 2 days later, frozen beside the animal he had tried to free. She remembered the way his gloves had still been wrapped around the moose's leg. He'd been trying to cut the wire even as the cold took him. Since then, Grace had pulled back. She shut down her wildlife work. She stopped accepting calls from the ranger station. Her world had narrowed to house pets, fences, and clean, sterile tables. The grief wasn't just about losing Martin. It was the betrayal of the wild, the betrayal of the trust she'd once held in nature. And now, here she was, with a lion cub sleeping in her home, and his father silently keeping vigil just beyond the trees. She looked toward the window. Leo's golden mane caught the light, a faint glint among the dark underbrush. His ears perked slightly as if he could feel her gaze. There was no menace in his stance, no tension in his posture, only waiting. Later that afternoon, Aiden returned with a brown paper bag filled with groceries, soup, crackers, bottled water, and a box of bandages. His face was flushed from the hike. "I told my mom I was bringing stuff to your clinic," he said quickly. "Didn't mention the lion." Grace arched an eyebrow but said nothing. Instead, she nodded toward the hearth. "He made it through the night." Aiden approached slowly, careful not to step too close. Dusty stirred as if sensing his presence, his little eyes fluttering open for a moment. He let out a hoarse, breathy sound. Aiden crouched beside him and gave a smile. "I think he remembers me," he whispered. "Probably remembers Scout more," Grace replied, but her tone was lighter than usual. The day passed slowly. Grace administered another round of antibiotics and cleaned the shoulder wound. Dusty flinched but no longer whimpered. He was regaining sensation, a good sign. His temperature stabilized. Grace updated a paper chart by hand, jotting down vital signs, fluid intake, and subtle changes in response. She hadn't used this old medical log in years. The sight of it open again on her counter felt both surreal and familiar. As dust settled, Thomas returned briefly with additional supplies, syringes, heating pads, and a larger crate, just in case they would need to move Dusty. He didn't stay long, just tipped his hat, checked on the cub, and handed Grace a folded note from the local ranger station. It was an official request to report any sightings of large predators near Ashridge trails. "They don't know what's out there," Thomas said, "and I won't tell them, not yet." Grace nodded. "He's not hunting, he's waiting." That night, Grace sat by the fire again. Scout snored gently. Dusty dreamed fitfully, legs twitching, breath short and fast. Grace reached for a pen and notebook, the same one she hadn't opened since Martin died. She wrote, "Tonight, I didn't feel afraid. Not of the cub, not of his father, not of the wild. For the first time in 3 years, I looked into the eyes of a predator and saw grief. Maybe that's what reminded me. Grief is grief, no matter the species." She set the pen down and stood, stretching. The air outside had grown colder. She walked quietly to the back porch, arms crossed against the chill. Leo was still there. His body was silhouetted against the tree line, unmoving. "You're braver than I've been," she whispered. Leo didn't respond, at least not in any way she could name, but in his stillness, in the way he didn't retreat, didn't growl, didn't vanish. There was something that looked a lot like trust, and that, for Grace Holloway, was enough to open the door to something she had locked away for far too long. The morning began with gray light seeping through the clouds, casting a somber hush over Ashridge Valley. A thin drizzle slicked the pine needles and washed the dust from the windows of Grace Holloway's cabin. Inside, the atmosphere was tense yet purposeful. Dusty lay curled in his blanket near the fire, his breathing shallow, eyes half-lidded. Though the antibiotics and warm fluids had steadied him overnight, the wound in his shoulder was deep, and the leg fracture had begun to swell dangerously. It was no longer a question of home care. The cub needed surgery, and soon. Grace stood over her medical chart, lips pressed into a line, pencil tapping restlessly against the counter. She was wearing her usual dark green fleece and cargo pants, hair tied back in a practical twist. There was a slight tremor in her fingers. Nerves, or urgency, or both. Aiden sat quietly on the other side of the room, his knees drawn up to his chest, watching every move Grace made. Scout was beside Dusty, lying alert and still, his head resting near the cub's flank, as if offering both warmth and silent encouragement. "We need to move him," Grace finally said. "The swelling's spreading too fast. If the infection reaches the bloodstream..." She didn't finish. Aiden nodded, face pale. "The Wildlife Rescue Center in Red Pine," she added. "It's about 2 hours northeast. They've got the equipment, the staff, and an operating table that can handle something less domestic." Aiden stood. "I'll come." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "You've earned that." She began prepping the transport crate, a sturdy steel cage lined with foam and thick towels, modified with heating pads and a small oxygen vent. Scout followed her movements intently. As she gently lifted Dusty into the crate, The cub gave a strained mewl, more air than sound, and curled his tail tighter around himself. Scout climbed into the back seat beside the crate without being told, positioning himself so his flank touched the metal bars. As Grace opened the cabin door to load them into her Jeep, she froze. There, at the edge of the forest, stood Leo. His body was slick with morning mist, mane darkened by the rain, and his eyes locked on the cabin. He didn't approach, didn't roar, didn't pace. He simply watched. Then, as Grace turned to lift the crate, Leo took a single step forward, then another, following them with slow, deliberate intent. Aiden stared through the foggy window as Grace drove. "Do you think he knows where we're going?" "I think," Grace said softly, eyes on the road. "He's going to make sure we get there." The drive to Red Pine was long and winding, a narrow road flanked by steep forest walls and high cliffs. Fog clung to the trees, and the rain turned to a mist that hovered over the asphalt like breath. Every few minutes, Aiden would glance back. Leo was there, sometimes visible through the trees, sometimes just a flicker of gold in the shadows. He kept a steady distance, never approaching, never falling too far behind. At one point, a deer crossed the road ahead of them. Scout perked up but didn't bark. Dusty stirred inside the crate, his paw twitching against the padding. Grace reached back to check the IV tubing. They arrived at Red Pine just before noon. The rescue center was a low, modern building, tucked behind tall fences and surrounded by sprawling fields. A few staff members, veterinarians, and wildlife biologists were already outside, unloading medical supplies from a white van. As Grace pulled in, the team froze. She stepped out, rain jacket clinging to her shoulders, and waved with forced calm. Emergency case. African lion cub, male, approximate age, 6 weeks, fractured leg, infected shoulder wound, possible internal trauma. Dr. Mina Cartwright stepped forward. She was a compact woman in her early 40s, with olive skin, short black hair, and the intense focus of someone who operated better under pressure than at rest. She wore a maroon scrub top and rubber clogs, and had 2 pens and a thermometer tucked behind her ear. "A lion," she repeated, "rescued in the wild, brought here in stable condition, needs surgery." Grace didn't mention the lion that had followed them across 60 miles of forest. She didn't have to, because just as Dr. Cartwright motioned for the crate to be unloaded, a sound, a deep, low growl reverberated from beyond the tree line. Everyone froze. From the mist, Leo emerged. He did not run, did not charge, did not roar. He stepped into view, as if he belonged there, as if this facility was built for him. Water clung to his mane in strands, his amber eyes unblinking. There was no violence in him, but no uncertainty either. He stood between the forest and the humans, muscles tensed, waiting. Scout jumped from the Jeep and moved toward Leo, not to challenge, but to stand alongside him. There was a beat of stillness, then Grace raised a hand. "He's the father. He's not here to hurt anyone." Mina blinked. "You brought a cub, and a wild lion followed you across state lines?" "He followed his son," Grace said. No one spoke for a moment. Then Mina turned toward the doors. "We need that cub prepped now. Get surgery suite 3 ready. I want vitals, x-rays, and a blood panel. Let's move." 2 assistants wheeled the crate inside, while Grace followed. Scout remained outside, sitting by the fence, his gaze shifting between the building and Leo. The surgery took nearly 2 hours. Grace wasn't allowed in hospital protocol, but she stood at the observation window the entire time. Aiden leaned against the wall beside her, chewing the cuff of his hoodie. Dusty's silhouette under the lights was tiny, vulnerable, but still moving. Mina emerged with her surgical mask hanging around her neck, sweat on her brow. The legs pinned, shoulder cleaned, no internal bleeding. He's young, he's got a shot. Grace exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. Later, as the rain picked up again and the forest grew darker, a few staff walked out to the fence. Leo was still there, sitting, waiting. "We can't let him stay here," one assistant whispered. "He's a wild animal." "No," Grace said. "He's a father." Rain had stopped, but the clouds lingered over Red Pine, casting the rescue center in a cool silver light that made the glass corridors shine like wet river stones. 2 days had passed since Dusty's surgery, and the world outside had discovered him. It began with a single post on Forest Watch, a local conservation forum written by a hiker who claimed to have seen a full-grown lion pacing the fence line while a shepherd dog kept guard. By dawn the next day, the story had leapt from browser tabs to breakfast tables. Montana lion father waits beside clinic wildlife miracle. Headlines bred headlines. Speculation spiraled faster than telephone wires could hum. Grace Holloway woke to the low grumble of delivery vans and the sharper clatter of camera tripods striking asphalt. She peered through the staff lounge blinds to find the parking lot dotted with reporters' bright windbreakers, drone cases, steaming coffee cups balanced on dashboards. In their midst stood Clara Bennett, a petite journalist for the Big Sky Chronicle, her auburn curls tucked beneath a corduroy newsboy cap. Clara's frame might have been slight, but her stance feet braced, notepad poised like a drawn sword spoke of stubborn resolve. She had once covered wildfires in Oregon and bore a thin white scar across her left temple, a souvenir from a falling ember. Since then, danger only sharpened her curiosity. Dusty, meanwhile, dozed in an ICU crate by the observation window. A post-op collar framed his still ruffled mane, and tiny stitches traced silver arcs across his shoulder. His eyes opened whenever Grace's voice drifted near. They tracked her as if she were an anchor in an unfamiliar sea. Beside the crate lay Scout, ever watchful, his tail thumping softly whenever Dusty shifted. At 9:30, Dr. Mina Cartwright summoned Grace to the administration wing. Waiting there was Elias Rowe, the center's director, tall, broad-shouldered mid-50s, with pepper-gray cornrows and a calm that seemed carved from basalt. His habit of folding enormous hands over a battered leather notebook gave him the aura of a patient schoolmaster. "We have to address the media," he said, voice steady. "Rumor fills a vacuum. Better we share facts than let fantasies grow claws." Grace glanced through the hallway glass. Beyond the inner gates, Leo was still present golden silhouette beneath a spruce, amber eyes reflecting daylight like polished tiger's eye. Photographers clustered at a wary distance, lenses clicking in syncopated bursts. Grace clenched her jaw. "Dusty is a patient, not an exhibit," she replied, "and Leo is grieving. We owe them privacy, not spectacle." Elias nodded. "Agreed, but you know how stories drift. If we stonewall, someone will try a midnight fence hop." He slid a press briefing draft across the table. Bullet points on Dusty's condition, the center's protocols, a request for respectful distance. "You'd be the best person to read this on camera." She almost refused, yet the alternative tabloid frenzy was worse. With a reluctant sigh, she agreed to noon. Outside Ashridge Elementary that same morning, recess bells chimed. Aiden Clark stood under the covered walkway, Scout at his heel. Permission notes signed by Principal Morrow allowed the dog on campus for an impromptu compassion assembly. Third graders spilled from classrooms in bright rain jackets, forming a loose semicircle. Scout's ears twitched at the chorus of gasps. He sat and offered a single polite bark. Small hands reached out, hesitating until Aiden said, "He's gentle." Scout's tail swept the concrete like a slow metronome. Among the children was Lucy Vaughn, an 8-year-old with cerebral palsy who moved with forearm crutches covered in butterfly stickers. She approached in careful steps, brown eyes wide. Scout lowered his head so her fingers could brush the fur between his ears. Her grin bloomed wide enough to split the gray morning, and for a heartbeat, Aiden felt the entire chaos of the past week crystallize into purpose. Bridging worlds was possible. Back at Red Pine, noon arrived. Grace stepped to a makeshift podium, flanked by Elias and Dr. Cartwright. Reporters adjusted boom mics. A drone buzzed overhead until a staffer waved it away. Clara Bennett raised a hand first, eyes bright behind half-moon glasses. "Dr. Holloway, is it true the adult lion has been present since the cub arrived?" Grace steadied her breath. "Yes. The adult male, whom we believe to be the cub's father, has remained near our perimeter. He has not displayed aggression. We are working with Montana Fish and Wildlife to monitor his movements and ensure everyone's safety." Tyler Cruz, a lanky freelance vlogger in neon sneakers, blurted, "Isn't that dangerous? What if he breaks in?" Elias answered calmly, "Our fencing is reinforced steel mesh rated for species larger than lions. Security personnel are on site. We ask the public not to approach or provoke the animal. Our priority is safe rehabilitation." Grace added, "The cub, Dusty, underwent surgery to repair a fractured tibia and deep shoulder lacerations. He is stable but critical. Media attention will not speed his recovery. She looked directly into Clara's lens. Please respect the barriers and remember there is a living, breathing family at the center of this story. After the briefing, Clara lingered by the staff gate. Grace hesitated, then approached. Clara tucked her pen behind her ear. Off record, she said, I covered the Wolf reintroduction hearings last year. Public opinion swung because people saw them as monsters, not parents. Your lion, he's changing that narrative. Grace folded her arms. I'm not interested in narratives. Clara smiled softly. Maybe not, but I think Martin would be proud. She nodded toward the photo clipped inside Grace's ID badge, Martin's grin under a ranger hat. Grace's throat tightened. She hadn't realized the badge print showed him so clearly. That night, floodlights cast long, pale cones across the compound. Leo remained beneath his spruce sentinel. Scout, having finished village ambassador duties, lay beside the fence, nose pressed to the chain link, offering silent companionship through cold steel. From the ICU window, Dusty watched them both, pupils dilated in the glow. Mina noted the vital sign monitor. Heart rate steady, oxygen saturation improved. He's stronger when he senses them, she said. Near midnight, a black SUV rolled to a halt at the far edge of the property. Two men stepped out, one stocky, wearing a camo jacket, the other thin with binoculars glinting under the floodlight halo. They spoke in hushed tones, pointing toward Leo. Before they could advance, Thomas Green emerged from the guard shack, shotgun resting in the crook of his elbow. More symbol than threat. His voice rang clear across the gravel. Park's closed, gentlemen. The men muttered something about photo rights and retreated to their vehicle. The engine growled away. Thomas spat into the dust, eyes narrowing. Word travels too far these days, he muttered before resuming his vigil. Inside, Grace updated Dusty's chart, then opened her notebook. Today the world met our secret, she wrote. I fear the glitter of curiosity more than the teeth of any beast. She looked up. Leo lifted his head in the darkness, as if hearing her unspoken sentence. For a moment, the cabin's harsh fluorescence, the clicking monitors, the distant rumble of reporters' generators all fell away, leaving only two silhouettes acknowledging each other across species, stories, and sorrow. The days unfolded like pages in a slow-turning journal. Each morning brought subtle change, one more second of eye contact, one more heartbeat that didn't flutter with uncertainty. Red Pine's ICU wing had quieted, the camera crews thinned out, moved on to fresher news, leaving behind only soft footprints in the gravel and the distant hum of curiosity that never entirely disappeared. Dusty, the once frail lion cub, was no longer just surviving. He was beginning to live. The first sign came with his eyes, no longer cloudy and glazed, but sharp, curious, golden like melted honey. One morning, as Grace leaned over to replace the bandage on his leg, Dusty's gaze followed the slow arc of a hawk drifting past the window. His pupils narrowed, his head tilted, and from deep within his chest came the smallest of growls. Not hostile, but instinctual, the voice of wild blood stirring. Scout, lying nearby, lifted his head at the sound and wagged his tail once, like a silent cheer. By the end of the week, Dusty was standing shaky at first, the legs still braced but determined. The nurses and interns began calling him the Little General. Even Dr. Cartwright, usually reserved, smiled whenever she passed the observation glass. He's got a fire in him, she'd said. Doesn't know he almost died. Each morning, as the sun broke over the eastern ridge, Leo returned. No one knew how he navigated the hills or which shadows he used as cover, but like clockwork, he would appear beneath the same spruce tree near the edge of the compound, never closer, never demanding. He simply watched. The staff grew used to his presence, even comforted by it. A few had started calling him the Sentinel. One night, just before closing, Aiden arrived with his mother, Megan Clark, a tall woman in her late 30s with soft eyes and dark curls that she always wore pinned back. She had the firm kindness of a school nurse, which she was, and she had resisted the idea of her son being involved in wild animal affairs until Grace personally called her. He's done more good than harm, Grace told her, and Dusty responds to him. Now, as Megan stood near the recovery window, watching her son kneel beside Dusty's crate, her expression softened. Aiden had brought a small, plush rabbit-a-toy from his younger years and offered it to Dusty through the bars. The cub sniffed it, batted it once with his paw, then curled around it with a low sigh. Megan reached for Grace's arm. That's the first time he's looked that calm all week. "It's the boy," Grace said. "He gives Dusty something familiar." Outside, Scout was back on duty, lying at the base of the chain-link fence. He had taken to positioning himself exactly opposite Leo, each day 2 sentinels, 2 guardians. Once or twice, they had even stood at the same time, moving in tandem as if some rhythm connected them. The staff began to joke that they had a language beyond sound. That evening, Grace finally opened the leather-bound journal she had tucked away in her bag for weeks. Not her medical log knot charts and doses and clinical details, but her personal notebook, the one with blank pages that had terrified her since Martin died. She sat alone in the small on-call room, feet curled beneath her, pen in hand. Entry 1. It started with a breath that shouldn't have lasted the night. A cub too small to live, and a father too wild to beg. But they both did, one by breathing, the other by staying. It's been years since I've trusted something untamed. Dusty is healing, and maybe I am too. The next morning, Thomas Green arrived early, parking his truck under the pine canopy. The seasoned ranger had dark circles under his eyes. He'd been patrolling the area nightly since the incident with the unauthorized SUV. He walked into the staff kitchen, poured a cup of the burnt coffee, and handed Grace a flash drive. "Motion camera footage," he said. "Trail cams we placed near the perimeter." Grace raised an eyebrow. "You think someone's still scouting?" "I think Leo's not the only one watching," Thomas said, "and he's the only one we trust." Later that day, Dusty took 5 full steps on his own before wobbling and collapsing into his blanket pile. Grace didn't help him up. She simply knelt beside him and whispered, "That's enough for today, warrior." The following morning, a new staff member joined the center temporarily. Her name was Camille Espinoza, a veterinary intern from the University of Colorado. She was 24 with cropped black hair, sleeve tattoos of mountain wildflowers on both arms, and a shy demeanor that masked a fierce intellect. Camille was soft-spoken but attentive, and she had a habit of scribbling anatomical notes on her palms when her notebook wasn't within reach. She had requested to intern at Red Pine after reading about Dusty. "I wanted to help him walk again," she told Grace, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace assigned her to Dusty's rehabilitation sessions, and within 2 days, Camille had designed a simple enrichment course with soft ramps and tactile paths. Dusty responded well, curious but cautious, testing his balance, favoring his injured leg slightly less with each step. Camille didn't speak much to the other staff, but she often knelt beside Dusty and hummed quietly as she worked, classical Spanish lullabies her grandmother had taught her. One night, just before lights out, Dusty rose and limped toward the window. Leo was there. Their eyes met across glass, fence, and field. Dusty let out a short, strained growl, not angry, not frightened. A call, a note of presence. Leo blinked once, then lay down again. Outside, the wind rustled the trees gently, and Grace, watching from behind the doorframe, let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The morning began still and heavy, the kind of silence that seemed to wrap around the hills like a wool blanket. Red Pine stirred slowly. Fog curled along the edges of the field, blurring the outlines of the trees and softening the sharp lines of the fence. Inside the main facility, the halls were hushed, as if the very walls understood the day carried a different weight. Dusty stood near the reinforced glass window of the observation room, stronger now, his frame filling out, his coat a richer gold. The surgical scar on his shoulder had begun to fade beneath new fur, and the limp in his step, though still present, was no longer hesitation. It was merely history echoing in motion. He had grown more vocal over the last few days, practicing soft rumbles that deepened with every sunrise. But that morning, he was quiet. Grace stood beside him, her hand resting gently on the metal of the enclosure. She wore her field jacket, the one with faded patches and deep pockets, and her eyes held a deep clarity, the kind earned only through loss, patience, and the slow return of faith. She had braided her hair back, like she used to before heading into long field days. It wasn't for practicality today. It was respect. Next to her, Scout lay with his head resting on his front paws. His ears twitched occasionally at the distant rustle of wind or bird call, but mostly he just watched Dusty, blinking slowly, as if committing every movement to memory. He had stayed at Dusty's side through every fever, every trembling attempt to stand, every small roar. Now, he simply stayed for the silence between them. Aiden had arrived early, too. His school had granted him the day off after a call from Grace. He wore his best flannel and boots too big for his feet. In his hand was the plush rabbit Dusty had once curled around. He gave it to Grace without speaking and sat on the bench by the door, his eyes rimmed red. Camille stood in the far corner, clipboard held close to her chest, her dark eyes unusually downcast. Even Dr. Cartwright, always brisk and clinical, had lingered longer during the final checkup, her gloved hands soft as she patted Dusty's flank. "I've signed off on transport," she said, voice quiet. "Vitals are strong. He's ready." The destination had been chosen carefully, the Wild Haven Reserve, a sprawling semi-wild habitat 2 hours north, tucked between low ridgelines and old-growth forest. It wasn't the wild savannas of Africa, but it was freedom fenced only at the farthest perimeters and monitored not by bars, but satellite. There, Dusty would live without collar or crate, a place to stretch, to learn the shape of solitude, to remember the feel of earth beneath claws. The transport vehicle pulled into the lot at 10:12 a.m. A modified wildlife truck with padded interior, oxygen ports, and high-visibility markings. Behind the wheel was Darnell Hayes, a seasoned wildlife mover in his mid-50s with weathered skin, silver buzz cut, and a calming baritone voice. He had moved wolves, bears, even a puma once mistaken for a mountain ghost. But as he stepped out and saw Grace's expression, he removed his gloves and said, "We'll take it slow." Grace nodded. "He's not cargo." The crate was wheeled out softly. Dusty stepped inside without resistance. There was no fear in his eyes, just a deep, watchful calm. Camille whispered something under her breath, perhaps a blessing, perhaps a goodbye. Scout followed the crate to the truck, sniffed its edges, then sat beside the wheel, unmoving. Grace looked once more toward the field. Leo was there. He stood atop the rise beyond the northern tree line, a silhouette against the breaking sun. His mane caught the light like fire trapped in threads of gold. He didn't pace. He didn't roar. He didn't move forward. He simply watched. It was the same position he had taken the day Grace first brought Dusty home. A full circle, a final vigil. The truck doors closed with a soft metallic click. Darnell climbed in, adjusted the rear camera feed, and started the engine. A low hum filled the air. Grace took a step back. Scout sat beside her, one paw pressed into the gravel, ears forward, still. Aiden reached for her hand. Neither spoke. The vehicle pulled out of the lot, tires crackling softly over the drive, heading toward the reserve road. As it disappeared around the bend, the last thing Grace saw in the rear camera was Dusty, head lifted, watching the sky. And Leo, he remained still. Then, as the truck faded beyond the hill, he lifted his head and blinked once, slowly, deliberately. A gesture not of farewell, but of release. The breeze picked up, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and something wilder still. It passed through the trees, stirred Grace's hair, and touched Scout's fur. It wrapped around Aiden and brushed the side of Grace's face like a hand once familiar, now gone. She closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, she saw Martin, smiling, wind in his hair, standing by the edge of the same tree line where Leo had stood. And she knew somehow that both had chosen trust over fear. Grace wasn't losing something today. She was letting it go into the wild, where it belonged. Back inside, she picked up her journal, the one she had been adding to, slowly, deliberately, each night. Entry 12. There are no words for this kind of goodbye. Only wind, eyes meeting, and a silence that says everything. Dusty left not as a patient, but as a creature of the wild. And Leo, he trusted us. That's all any of us really hope for in this world. To be trusted with something precious, and to know we didn't fail it. Sometimes the deepest bonds are formed without a single word. In a world that often rushes past quiet moments, the story of Leo, Dusty, and Scout reminds us that trust, presence, and silent compassion can heal what we thought was broken. In your own life, maybe there's someone watching from a distance, just waiting to be seen, to be understood. If this story touched you, share it with someone who believes in second chances. Like the video, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced a moment of silent connection that changed everything?